Aloha, everyone. And on this episode of Faith in Politics, we're going to be talking about a few more executive orders. We're going to talk about the pandemic and what's going on. We're also going to talk about statehood. Is 50 states enough, or do we need one more? And of course, as always, we're going to look at what's happening in the mind of Jim Hockberg. So let's chat about that. Several scriptures about the healing that just took place. And there are several scriptures. I don't know about you, but when I'm told to hold something to myself and it's really exciting, I have a difficult time doing that. When you share an exciting story or event with someone else, it becomes a chain that becomes stronger with each link. The Bible talks about this in Ecclesiastes 4:12. Though one may be overpowered, two can defend themselves. A cord of 3 strands is not easily broken. This week in history, on March 23rd, 1775, Patrick Henry spoke to the Second Virginia Convention, which was meeting in Richmond St. John's Church. And he said, and I quote, "I consider it as nothing less than a question of freedom or slavery. I know of no way of judging the future but by the past. Let us not, I beseech you, sir, deceive ourselves. Sir, we have done everything that could be done to avert the storm which is now coming on. We have petitioned, we have remonstrated, we have supplicated, we have prostrated ourselves before the throne. Our petitions have been slighted. Our remonstrances have produced additional violence and insult. Our supplications have been disregarded, and we have been spurned with contempt from the foot of the throne." And here is where the cord with 3 strands comes in. And I continue quoting, "There is a just God who presides over the destinies of nations, who will raise up friends to fight our battle for us. The battle, sir, is not to the strong alone. It is to the vigilant, the active, the brave," end quote. There are a lot of people in the faith-based community who have reached out to me over the past week, and they're concerned about the course of our country. The lines in the sand have been drawn, and each side seems unwilling to talk to the other side. Others are weary of fighting with people in their families, their jobs, their communities. Some have experienced bullying from bosses, strangers, and even friends, and they are asking if this polarization will ever end. Having said that, the most interesting thing, though, that I've heard from them is not despair, because they're not going to give up. Quite the contrary, in fact. They have strengthened their love for this country, their love for the children, the burdens that are going to be placed on their shoulders, their passion for faith, and their commitment to hold on to Jesus no matter the cost. If Christ sets us free, then we are free indeed. In that manner, we all agree with the final words of Patrick Henry in his speech that day in 1775. And I quote, "Is life so dear, or peace so sweet as to be purchased at the price of chains and slavery? Forbid it, Almighty God. I know not what course others may take, but as for me, give me liberty or give me death," end quote. And that's my thoughts for the week.
That quote always makes me tear up.
It does.
It does.
It does. And it happened this week. We're celebrating the anniversary of that speech.
Well, it just happened to me.
Oh, did it?
And so I'm going to say, though, that he didn't speak very good English, because most people have no idea what he was talking about. He could have just said, "Hey, brah, we don't like what you doing here."
Brah, I know. But you know what's interesting, and the reason I was thinking about that is because, I get these historical updates on, what has taken place. And when I saw this quote—
Like this day in history.
This day in history kind of a thing. And I was— just like you, I love that quote. But I think a lot of times in history, in the classrooms, the kids don't see all of the other speech that came
Correct.
with it.
That's true.
And he was pretty frustrated that he felt like they were not being heard.
In fact, if you read the list of grievances in the Declaration of Independence, that's what they were talking about. There's like 18 things listed. You did this and you did this, and we don't like you for that.
And don't you feel like that's kind of the conversations that are taking place today? I mean, people have a list of grievances. I mean, it doesn't matter if you're a Republican or a Democrat, you have your grievances.
But you want to know something I was thinking about this week? If the cancel culture was in force back then, there was a other group of patriots or colonists called the Tories that did not want to break off from England. What if they were in charge of all the newspapers back then? We wouldn't have had a Revolutionary War.
Well, let's think about that. If everybody got their way right now with the cancel culture and everybody who had an opinion that somebody didn't like somewhere, can you imagine what kind of society we would have?
It would be like the Norwegians.
Well, you know what I could do? I could put myself in a room, sit in front of a mirror and chat with myself, because then I would never offend myself. So I can have a continued conversation with myself.
But the culture of Norway, according to Lillehammer, which is the show that we're watching about that, but it's also kind of my knowledge of having been in Europe a lot. They really, really, really want to be super polite and they don't want to offend anybody. And the government basically tells everybody what they can do, and that's how they live. So it would be like in Norway.
Okay. Well, let's jump into the first thing that we want to talk about in this segment. So there's been a couple more executive orders, and I know that is your absolute favorite thing to discuss.
I actually don't like them.
No, and you know what's really funny? I mean, please correct me if I'm wrong, and I can be wrong. I'm human. I make mistakes, but did we not hear the entire...
Can I have a clip of that statement, please, producers?
Yes, let's make this public. So here's the thing. When Trump was president, did we not hear a lot of complaints about all his executive orders?
Well, we heard complaints, but it wasn't an avalanche of orders in the same day, day after day after day. It's once a week he'd throw one out there or something. All presidents do that. The president's position is he runs the executive branch. And this is why the Electoral College is so important. The president gets elected according to the Electoral College, which allows the population across the country to have a fair chance of electing the president. The president then appoints the guys that are going to run all those branches of the executive department, all those departments. They have people working for them who implement the president's vision for the departments, as these, we're going to talk about them in the ones today. So all presidents come in, and if there's things they disagree with that were executive department policies, they can change them by executive order. That's perfectly within their authority.
Well, in his press conference that he just did, President Biden did talk, he was asked about that, about him redoing all these executive orders to basically undo everything that President Trump had done. And they asked him specifically about that. And his comment was that he felt that Trump's executive orders were failures. And so he had to undo them so that he could do more work and better work for the country. I mean, that's
which
really
he'd
what
have
he
to
said.
say, because if he said they were great policies, I just hate Trump, so I'm reversing them, that wouldn't be very good.
Well, the biggest question I get when it comes to these presidential, these executive orders, it's like, why don't Congress just do their job?
Well, and I'm actually going to be talking a bit about that in the third segment.
Oh,
why do we not have the country that we're supposed to have?
Good. So we want to make sure that our listeners and viewers stick around to The World According to Jim, because you're going to talk about that. So the two executive orders that I want to talk about, the first one is Executive Order 14021, and that's guaranteeing an educational environment free from discrimination on the basis of sex, including sexual orientation and gender identity. And really, I mean, there's been a lot of talk, right? I mean, we last week we talked about the Equal Rights Amendment, right? We've talked about Title IX. We've talked about all the protections for women in sports and all that. So it seems like this is just continued discussion on that. I'd like to get your thoughts on that.
Well, actually, it's a huge political move, because one of them sets up the council and then says who's going to be on the council and then says who's going to work for the people on the council. And that could be done anyway, silently. It doesn't need an executive order, but he wants everybody to see how pro-gender identity and sexual orientation he is, so he's doing it with this big executive order. It's not necessary.
Well, and I think it's interesting, too, because the other thing that happened this week is that there is a new person that has now been appointed in their position in the
Becerra's assistant.
Becerra's assistant, right, in the Department of Health and Human Services. Now, this is the very first transgendered person to serve in this position. And so,
why is that important? Why can't I just see the way this person presents themselves and say to myself, well, that's an older, kind of unattractive woman. Why do I have to know
Jim,
the inside
beauty
details?
is always coming from the heart.
Why does it matter if you're going to be working in health and human services? whether you think you're a boy or a girl.
Well, and I agree with you. I mean, as a female, I appreciate when I see that there's a good balance of females that are placed in positions of leadership.
But that's a man.
But the point is that I'm answering your comment, which I agree with. I don't care. I don't care if you're female. I don't care if you're a male. I don't care if you're Hispanic. I don't care if you're Japanese. I don't care if you're white, if you're going to do the job.
And the thing that comes to my mind as a potential problem, if the person that's the second in command after Mr. Becerra, who has nothing to do with health, he's a lawyer that likes lawyering, if the second person in charge is a trumpeting transgender, it would appear maybe problematic because the agenda will be being forced down through that executive department in all the states under the Electoral College system.
And that's the point that I want to make, because the second executive order that we were going to talk about is Executive Order 14020, which is the establishment of the White House Gender Policy Council, of which the Department of Health and Human Services does have a position. And I know, Jim, and we're going to talk about this in the last quarter, the last segment, so we want people to stick around, is you have some personal feelings about the stacking of task force.
Oh, you're giving me nightmares from 95.
Yes. So we're gonna talk about that in the fourth quarter. So we want people to stick around.
You should have warned me about that.
Well, I'm sorry.
You're triggering me.
Take a sip of your coffee. Take a sip of your coffee. Take a deep breath.
Yes,
okay.
ma'am.
So we want our listeners and viewers to stick around because we're going to be talking about that. So basically, this policy council that he's talking about, it's basically set up to do what?
To run gender things through the federal government. I mean, it used to be that the federal government took the substance of their responsibility as the primary focus. And with this administration, gender identity is like the primary focus in these different departments based on who they're putting in. And whether a person's transgender or not doesn't tell me anything about their qualification to work in the department. I don't know why it matters.
Well, history is going to give us that information, because after all of this is said and done, history is going to be able to look at all of these presidential administrations, all of them, to say whether it was successful or not, and whether the people appointed to these positions did their job. And that's really what most Americans care about.
So if you want the future historians to write what we used to consider to be a journalistic approach, finding the truth, we can't let these people keep getting elected because they'll hide the truth in the future backwards look.
Well, and I think with the cancel culture too, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, So if they're going to not allow something to be put in there because somebody might find it offensive, then will history be accurate? I mean, last week you talked about historical documents like a birth certificate now doesn't mean what it used to mean. So I think that just as a regular law-abiding citizens, we need to be concerned. Now, when it comes to these presidential, these executive orders, Jim, so President Biden has done 37 of them to date. And he was talking recently about doing one on gun control. So I'd like to see what your thoughts are on that.
We're going to be talking about that because my Second Amendment case pending in the federal court here is, as of yesterday, being released from the Ninth Circuit's hold because they made a decision on the Big Island concealed carry case, which our judge wanted to see that first. So we're going to be doing that again. So we'll be talking about that.
All right. You're listening and watching Faith in Politics. And when we come back, we're going to be talking about statehood for Washington. We're going to be talking about the COVID pandemic and what are some of the implications for that. So we'll see you in a moment.
We have a mission here at Carlo TV. We continue to be the only local Christ-centered media outlet in Hawaii. God has planted this station to nourish believers and to harvest souls for eternity. It's a calling we hold dear, and today we need your help. Partner with us as we continue to create original local programs.
We're so very grateful for that whole journey.
Walking down to our story room.
Oh my gosh.
So it's where the state cannot tell the church how to run their services, what songs to sing.
Showcase solid biblical teaching.
We reach more people in one day with the broadcast of the gospel.
It's music to God's ears.
Improve our infrastructure and influence social media. In these dark and disruptive times, there's never been a greater need to be rooted in God's Word. The Carlo plant has been a sustaining food in Hawaii for centuries. and Carlo TV aims to bring much-needed spiritual nutrition to these islands. Are you willing to labor with us for Hawaii, for your ohana, for the next generation? Go to carlotv.com and partner with us today.
Aloha, I'm Eva Andrade. I'm the president and CEO of Hawaii Family Forum. And Hawaii Family Forum has been serving the faith-based community right here in Hawaii since 1998. What we do is we identify like-minded people in the community, we educate them, we motivate them, and then we activate them, standing on the foundational principles of Micah 6:8, which says, "What does the Lord require of you but to love justice and to do mercy and to walk humbly with your God?" So join us at hawaiifamilyforum.org and let's make a difference right here in this beautiful state of Hawaii. Mahalo. Aloha and welcome back to Faith in Politics. And right now what we're going to do is we're going to talk about statehood for Washington. I mean, is 50 states enough?
D.C., not the state of Washington's a state.
Okay, thank you. What would I do without you, Jim?
Probably
what would I do
freedom.
without you?
You'd have more freedom.
Okay, so we're going to be talking about House Resolution 51, which would alter the Capitol area size, as well as making the Capitol technically, quote, the principal federal monument, the White House, the Capitol building, the United States Supreme Court building, and the federal executive, legislative, and judicial office buildings located adjacent to the mall and the Capitol building. End quote. There are 700,000 people in Washington, D.C., and they believe that there should be a state because they would like to have representation without taxation, or representation because they're being taxed. They pay taxes. So they want to be able to do that. And of course, those that oppose this believe that there is... All the Democrats are doing is building one more state so that the Republicans can never again have any control.
Well, they're making that monument a monument because they have to, unless they want to amend the Constitution. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. The more interesting reason the proponents are now giving to make D.C. a state is because it's 90-something% African Americans. And to not make it a state is racist, which is amazing to me because nobody made people move to Washington, D.C. It makes no sense to me.
Well, you're a historical kind of guy. You like to read all the founding documents. Yes, you are. I know you were there when Moses parted the Red Sea, Jim. I know you were. You were there when the 10 Commandments were chiseled. I know you were.
So I'm going to use that phrase. I wasn't there before the leaves.
There you go. Okay, so explain to people, because people may not know.
Fig leaves.
Jim. Okay, so people may not know why Washington, D.C. doesn't have that. Why are they not a state right now?
Okay, so let's go back to 1776. Let's go back to 1789 when the Constitution was adopted. You have these 13 states, and they really had issues with the federal government, but they came together and they made one. That's the Constitution. And then they decided that the area that the government of the nation was going to occupy could not be in a state, because which of these states was going to get to be the one with all the power? And there were only 13. It was an issue. Okay. So they actually wrote this in Article 1, which is the legislative branch, Section 8. This is what they said. Article 1, Section 8. And Article 1 is the legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in a Congress of the United States, which shall consist of a Senate and a House of Representatives. The Congress, Section 8, the Congress shall have power to lay and collect taxes, duties, blah, 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 blah. And then the Congress shall have the power, here's the quote, to exercise exclusive, that means nobody else but Congress, exclusive legislation in all cases whatsoever over such district, and they said how big it was going to be, not exceeding 10 miles square, as may, by cessation of particular states and the acceptance of Congress, become the seat of government of the United States. and to exercise like authority over all places purchased by the consent of the legislature of the state in which the land came from for the erection of forts, magazines. So they're saying the states don't have legislative control over federal properties that the United States government buys in states or around the seat of government, the states give it up by cessation. That is D.C. So if D.C. is going to become a state, this has to be amended.
Okay, I was going to say that.
Which is why I think racism is the reason to do the amendment. We've amended the Constitution after the Civil War for bases of racism. We got to amend this because of racism. But imagine how the day-to-day legislation affecting people's lives in D.C. as a state would be. Right now, Congress passes all laws that have anything to do with people in D.C. You would have the state legislature and you would have the Congress. And depending on who was in charge in the Congress and the state legislature, you could have conflicting laws, which is one of the reasons that the Constitution itself requires that the Congress have exclusive legislative power over the seat of government.
Well, Washington, D.C., it's not like they don't have any power because I believe they do have 3 delegates, right?
They're non-voting.
They're non-voting.
Yeah.
So it's not like that they don't have some form of representation. So,
and it's not like they're Guam, way far away. The people that are working in the legislature, in the Congress, the congressmen themselves, they live there. They know what's going on. It's not like they have no representation. They have actual eye contact every day that people are in town.
Now this particular discussion, when it moves over to the Senate, there isn't, there's always, they're unsure of how it's going to actually play out once a vote happens because the vote is so close in the Senate. I want to jump to the next issue, which is the bill that talks about correcting any problems with elections, right? And I know that you have said ad nauseum over the past several weeks that the states are the ones that control their election laws.
And it's actually the counties within the states, but it's not Congress.
Right. It's not Congress. But the discussion that's taking place is that it would be Congress, that Congress is going to make a one-size-fits-all laws. And there is, Jim, there is angry people on both sides about this particular issue and going back to what the vote would look like in the Senate if they actually voted on this. So President Biden has been talking about getting rid of the filibuster. So, and it goes also to that other bill that we just talked about. Mm-hmm. So let's talk about that for a minute, because all of these things, and this is just one of many issues that could be a problem if the filibuster is removed.
So why does the Senate have a filibuster rule, which basically means you have to get 60 votes?
And how many? There's 100,
There's
right?
100 senators.
Okay.
If another state gets added, 2 senators get added with each state. Yeah, every state has 2. It's different from the House, where it's based on population. And the Senate has to have 60 votes to move a bill to a vote. And if a senator does not want to let that happen, they can filibuster. One person can filibuster, stop the vote from taking place to move it to a vote. And there's a good reason for that. The founding fathers set up the Senate and the House differently to be a brake on legislation. The members of the House originally were elected by the people in the states, and the Senate was originally elected by the state legislatures. So the Senate was there with a different constituency. Today, because of Woodrow Wilson, that's no longer the case. But originally, the Senate was protecting the interests of the states against the federal government. The House was protecting the interests of the people across the country against the federal government.
You know what's interesting, Jim, in President Biden's, speech that he gave today when he had his press conference, they talked about this issue. And one of the reporters asked him about voting, right? And that many states are actually, Republican states are working to, fix some of these problems. And his response is that he felt it's sick. That was his quote. He said that's just sick because they truly believe that it's voter suppression, that the Republican states are trying to keep people of color from voting.
And what does not happen, and remember, my undergraduate degree is in journalism. What does not happen is these reporters don't say, Mr. President, could you give us specific examples of voter suppression out of requiring an ID? Because it's talking points. It's just talking points. The problem is people don't read the Constitution. They print it up in little teeny things that you can stick in your pocket. It's called a pocket Constitution. I almost always have one in my briefcase. I do always have one in my briefcase. I often have one in my pocket. We need to get these into the hands of people. It's really super skinny.
But Jim, we
got to read it.
I know that you're going to roll your eyes because I've known you for a long time and I know this bothers you, but there are a lot of people that believe that the Constitution is a living, breathing document. And so you might have a pocket Constitution, but they're going to say, but that's not the way that it should be interpreted today. And actually, we're seeing that take place in some of the courts.
And some people believe that 9/11 was an inside job by Bush, and some people believe that Lee Harvey Oswald didn't shoot President Kennedy. I don't care.
So the point is that people should know as a historical document what the Constitution says. And
there's actually deep reasons. In fact, we're going to talk about it with respect to COVID.
Yes.
Why we need to enforce our right to control our government.
And it's why a lot of the conservatives are very concerned about people being appointed to the courts that have this idea that the Constitution is changeable. And
that's right. And in fact, if we go back to when I first started supporting Donald J. Trump for president in 2016, it was not until I saw the list of people he thought should go on the Supreme Court.
Yeah, and he
that sold me.
And he was pretty transparent about that, that he was going to stick to his list. I mean, do we know if President Biden has released a list? Because there is some talk about him expanding the court.
Well, if he released a list, he forgot to print anything on it. It was a blank piece of paper.
Well, maybe he will. Maybe he'll get there.
Perhaps.
But again, what we're going to always encourage people to do is it only takes a minute. You can go to the government website, president, his webpage, and all of these things, executive orders, his press conferences. I looked, I didn't see his conference today, if there's any remarks. But I'm going to be doing that because I want to see exactly what he said. Because
and let me just interrupt you because we're going to be running out of time too. When you look at those executive orders, like the one we were talking about today about that council, they don't put the person's name that's going to be appointed. They put their job title, but you can actually look at the job title online and find out who the person is. And when you see these human beings with these political interests, you know what this council's all about.
Well, and it's why there are a lot of citizens that will watch these Senate confirmation hearings, because these are the questions that the senators are asking them, asking them what their background is. In fact, it's why Dr. Levine got so much attacks during the hearing because...
Well, he had some child mutilation, gender change things and stuff like that. That's good for you.
Okay.
No, but seriously, doing sex change surgeries on minors is something that he should have been willing to talk about, and he really wasn't.
And there was a lot of senators that wouldn't let, that go by too easily during the questioning because they were asking simple questions. Do you support this? Do you support this?
Yep.
And these guys are trained in their answers to say, this is a complicated issue.
They're talking points. That's the thing. We've gotten to the point where truth is no longer part of justice. It really bugs me, actually.
It does too. And when you and I were able to go speak to Teen Pac,
that was last week. That was great.
That was great. And just so you know, I got contacted from one of the young women that were part of Teen Pac, and she said she wants to volunteer and do some work for us and do some research. And, one of the things we like to tell youth, right, is that their voice matters because when they are an adult, they're going to be fighting some of these issues. So they have a right to raise their voice as well.
Absolutely. That's great. I didn't know that.
Yeah. So you and I will stay we will stay connected on that, obviously. And as we move into the next segment, we're going to figure out what's happening in the mind of Jim Hockberg. And as I don't know about you, but every week I'm like, okay, this is interesting. And I'm looking forward to it. So stick around as we peel the curtain back to find out what Jim Hockberg is thinking this week. We'll be right back. Aloha, I'm Eva Andrade. I'm the president and CEO of Hawaii Family Forum. And Hawaii Family Forum has been serving the faith-based community right here in Hawaii since 1998. What we do is we identify like-minded people in the community, we educate them, we motivate them, and then we activate them, standing on the foundational principles of Micah 6:8, which says, "What does the Lord require of you but to love justice and to do mercy and to walk humbly with your God?" So join us at hawaiifamilyforum.org and let's make a difference right here in this beautiful state of Hawaii. Mahalo.
We have a mission here at Carlo TV. We continue to be the only local Christ-centered media outlet in Hawaii. God has planted this station to nourish believers and to harvest souls for eternity. It's a calling we hold dear, and today we need your help. Partner with us as we continue to create original local programs.
We're so very grateful for that whole journey.
Walking down to our story room.
Oh my God.
Showcase solid biblical teaching.
We reach more people in one day with the broadcast of the gospel.
It's music to God's ears.
Improve our infrastructure and influence social media. Are you willing to labor with us for Hawaii, for your ohana, for the next generation? Go to carlotv.com and partner with us today.
Hey everybody, welcome to Talk Story Unscripted. My name is Pete.
I'm Doug.
And I'm Jason Tom, the human beatbox.
I've wanted to say this my whole life. Are you ready?
Are you ready?
Drop that beat!
Your turn.
Yeah, I love you being here, dude. You are talented and you are full of God's word. I love it.
Yeah, encouraging. I think it's really important, you know. And I love what you have to say about your identity.
Yeah.
That's more important than even any talent or anything like that.
Right.
It's who you are in Christ. Yeah.
You're gonna get hated on, right? But the thing is this, are what they saying drowning out what God's saying about you? See, God can close doors on the enemy, but he can also open doors that no man can shut. So, for example, if you open a door to Carlo TV, welcome, welcome, welcome.
Hi, this is Jim Hockberg, and this is what my world looks like today. So just 6 months ago, on October 12, 2020, a study was published in the Journal of Science, Public Health Policy, and the Law. It didn't get much attention. Shortly before that, in August of 2020, the CDC said that COVID was the sole cause of death of only 6% of the deaths counted as COVID-19 deaths. So that meant that 94% were not solely COVID, and they actually had 2.6 additional conditions of cause of death. Why would the CDC decide to use a system that violated the law for their counting? Very interesting. It raises some questions. Instead of an untested and unproven system that they developed for COVID-19 without any discussion or peer review, which changed a 17-year-old everyday used federal government process, and why did the CDC's decision to abandon that known and proven effective system also potentially breach several federal laws that ensure data accuracy and integrity? And finally, did the CDC knowingly alter rules for reporting causes of death in the presence of comorbidity exclusively for COVID-19? So I want to talk about that study. And it is available. We're going to put the link on. I want you to please read it. It's got a lot of science in it that I'm not going to talk so much about. But basically, in 2003, the CDC, following the requirements of the law, published this new way of counting comorbidities and deaths and stuff for coroners, figuring out death certificates and all that. And the government is required, if it's going to come up with a new policy, to publish that new policy as a proposed action in the Federal Register, and it has to be there for 60 days to let all the other agencies, all the private interest groups, all the private individuals that have input on that write their comments in. Then the agency takes the comments and changes the proposed policy into a final policy and publishes it again before it goes into effect. So you usually have 90, 120 days where we're looking at a proposed policy before it becomes law. Didn't happen in COVID. And it's very interesting.
And you said this was 2003?
Was the time that they created the one that's been in effect since then.
Okay.
And it's still in effect for everything but COVID.
Right. Okay.
So in March and April of 2020, the CDC and some private medical interest groups didn't go through this process. They just came up with new ways to count COVID mortality. And the way they did it was to instruct the people filling out death certificates, which expanded beyond coroners, which the 2003, it was directed to coroners. This was for other people too, to change the order in which the cause of death was going to be put on the death certificate. So item 1 is usually the comorbidity, and a virus that hastened the death under that comorbidity is usually in section 2. They flipped them around. Now, if you had a comorbidity, COVID was the first reason and the comorbidity became the secondary death reason. So what did that do? Oh, it gave the CDC way more deaths from COVID that created a huger emergency that required lockdowns and that required unemployment and all that stuff. So we're going to put on the screen page 20 of the study, which is a graph, because graphs are cool. And it's comparing the total COVID-19 fatalities based upon those two, 2003 versus 2020, death reporting guidelines. So there were 161,392 total fatalities using guidelines published by the CDC on March 24, 2020, exclusively for COVID. Did not go through the process of letting us all see what it was. Total fatalities using CDC guidelines in use for 17 years prior to March 24, 2020 for COVID-19, less than 10,000 deaths.
Across the entire United States.
For that period of time. This was published October 12th. So up until October of last year. And this study's been around since October 12th, and it hasn't been reviewed. No, I mean, it's a peer-reviewed study, and it's not in the news.
So what you're saying is the 500,000 people that are reported to have died from COVID haven't really died from COVID.
Well,
They've died from their secondary,
which was actually
cause.
The primary, but then COVID hastened it because of the breathing.
So they flipped it around. Now let me ask you this: are they using that same formula as they're reporting the deaths from vaccinations? Because what people
probably not.
Okay, so why? So why is this? Why?
Well, that's the interesting thing, and that's what I really want to talk about. The way our system of government is put together, you own your government. And if you don't require that you exercise your ownership interest, this is the kind of stuff they can do to you. So what do I mean? It's the same on the state level as on the federal level. When the government wants to create a policy that's going to regulate you, you have the right to participate in the drafting and the analysis and the decision-making on what the text is going to be.
How?
At the legislature, you look at bills, you listen to Eva, she helps you provide testimony. When it's a department of the executive branch, the governor in the state of Hawaii, the president in D.C., these policies have to be published in the Federal Register, which is in the library. It's online. You read the text, and if you have an interest in whatever that thing is, mostly probably a financial interest, because that's where we put our time, then you read it and you send in comments to say, you know, this isn't a good idea because of this, or this isn't a good idea, maybe you should do it this way. They take all those comments. On the state level, they do it. On the federal level, they do it. And then the agency comes up with the final. If the agency's final doesn't take into consideration the concerns of the population, you can sue over it because it's in the law, and therefore we need to own our rights and we need to exercise our rights.
Okay, so what? Okay, so you've shared this. It's great information, but most people watching and listening are going to go, okay. So
well, we're going to put a link to the study on the website.
Okay, and
the study actually has a whole section that's not the science. It's the politics of how it happened. Okay. What the agencies are that are supposed to participate in the publication of the proposed act.
Okay, but I mean, but what are you asking? So somebody goes and they click on this study and they're looking at it. What are you asking people to do? Because I mean, most people their eyes are going to glaze over when they're looking at this kind of detailed information like this. So what are you asking people to do?
What I want everybody to do, at some point, because there's an issue that's of interest to you personally. I'm not suggesting that anybody look at the Federal Register every day. I mean, it's actually more than 8 shelves in the law library. It gets published every day, and they're paperback books, but it's way easier to find them online.
Right.
So if you hear about something that Congress is doing, if you hear about the executive orders for the divisions of the executive branch that we're talking about, go online. Ask why they're not publishing these things so that you have a chance to comment.
Ask who?
Well, if it's an executive order, it's the Office of the President of the United States.
Okay.
And if we don't say anything, then they can get away with it. And when they can get away with it on that, they'll get away with it on this, and then they'll get away with it on that other thing. We need to rein them in.
Okay. I want to address that because when we do our call to actions, as we did on a couple of the national issues like the Equality Act, people are making contact to their senators or their representatives. And what people get back, and I know because they're forwarding the responses to me, are these answers that they're the same thing for everybody. They just change who it's going out to. There is no real effort to have a conversation. So what do you say to people that go, I've contacted my congressperson and they give me these form letters. There is no real way for me to have a good conversation with these politicians.
Well, you got to be a pit bull and you got to have a bone that you want to keep, which is your ownership of your government, and you can't just lightly participate. You got to be Patrick Henry. Give me liberty or give me death.
And what I liked about Patrick Henry when going back to that is that he didn't just passionately go in anger and yell at anybody. He really laid out the way he was going to participate in this great nation and the forming of it. And I think that that's the biggest advice we can give to people. Sure, you can be angry about this, Jim, but you're not going to get anywhere with your congressional leaders if you send them an email that says, you're not doing your job. I'm going to vote you out.
Let me address it, because every single person watching and listening that's unemployed because of COVID, if you will drag this out of the internet, look at this study and send it to the governor, send it to the Office of the President, Housing and Human Services, everybody, and tell them this isn't okay with you and you want a response to the specifics in here, and don't let them give you a form letter.
Yeah, I will say that a couple of our people, our constituents, I was really proud of them, Jim. They got their form letters back and then they responded again. Thank you so much for the form letter, but I need to know why you believe this. And, I've got to say that even if our congressional leaders don't necessarily agree with us on some of these issues, I have to say that, like Representative Case, he started to respond back on a more personal, probably not him, it's probably his staff. But the point is that there was an attempt to have a conversation. And I think that's what we need to encourage people, is to have the conversation. Don't threaten. Do not threaten people that you're going to vote them out of office, because here in Hawaii, it doesn't happen and you become a paper tiger. And we had somebody at one of the action training events that we had, Jim, that were basically telling us to stop telling people to run for office because they felt like that we weren't going to get anywhere.
We don't have real elections. That's why.
Well,
they said the elections are fake.
Well, yeah. I mean, and we can kind of see where they're coming from. Sure. I mean, people here in Hawaii do feel kind of beat up, especially if you're on the Republican and conservative side. You feel like you don't have a voice.
Well, and I think if the cancel culture attacks you because you think the election for the president in last year was not fair. Well, if they're going to attack you for thinking that, it probably wasn't fair.
Well, and we also want to encourage people to check your sources. I have to be honest that I see some of the things people forward, Jim, and they're not checking their sources. And it doesn't help us if we're putting out false information or fake information or information that we have not taken a moment to just verify. And it isn't easy to do. Let's be honest about that.
Well, and one thing I want to talk about this study. I understand COVID was a bad thing. It was an emergency. They had to do stuff, but they don't have to keep this going now. That's my point. They need to go back to the 2003 death certificate counting regime because it went through the legal process.
All right. And when we come back, we're going to continue this discussion because I know there's a few more things that Jim wants to talk about. And we're going to talk about some local issues right here in Hawaii. And we're going to tap into Jim's mind about this task force and having things unbalanced. So we'll be right back.
It's no secret that Carlo TV is the only local Christian TV station reaching the islands of Hawaii with 24/7 Christ-centered content. Just how important is Carlo TV to our culture?
Think about it. This year has been unprecedented. The pandemic lockdown, churches closed, religious freedom, a nation divided, cultural unrest. If there's ever a time that we need Christ-centered content, it is now.
Our community is struggling. Depression, suicide, unemployment, lack of purpose. Many of us are without hope. In fact, some of us are considered non-essential.
Non-essential? That's absurd. In fact, there's never been a more crucial time that the church is essential. We have the hope of Christ, the answer for our time.
And Carlo TV is committed to broadcasting the good news across Hawaii.
And that's why we're reaching out even more to those in need of God's love. Here's how.
We're starting a new initiative called Carlo Outreach, where we're going into our local communities and becoming the hands and feet of Christ.
We continue to create new and original programs that will reach every generation with the hope of Jesus.
We are adding new local and international programs to Carlo TV. After all, it is our intention to be a bright light to Hawaii and beyond.
Look, it hasn't been easy for any of us. In fact, if you need prayer, we are here for you.
And if you need encouragement, please tune in. Whether it's on air, online, or on social platforms, our vision is to provide uplifting content.
Would you join us as we broadcast the good news? This is our opportunity to come together as a community.
Right now is a pivotal time to invest in Hawaii. First and foremost, let's pray together for Hawaii. And for those who are able to, here are some ways that you can give.
As we are that the sun will set tonight and rise again tomorrow morning, so is our hope in Christ.
Carlo TV, the Aloha station, broadcasting Aloha 24/7.
Welcome back. We so enjoy having these moments where we share our hearts with you, and we're so happy that you take time out of your schedule to join us. So thanks for joining us once again. So Jim, let's jump back into this idea of what we shared in the third quarter, because we did get a letter from one of our listeners. So let's give a shout out to Judy.
Well, before you get into that though, a bunch of my friends and people that I run into are telling me that they're watching the show, and I'm at.
Yeah. Okay. So the way you can do it is you can watch live at 10 a.m. on Friday on YouTube, and there is a live chat that you can go ahead and...
Like if you're on Facebook.
Yes. And then what you can do is if you're watching it later after it's been recorded, you can still put comments. And we do want to hear from you. We want to take a moment to hear from our listeners, because it's going to help us grow, right? And it's going to give us more to talk about. So,
and we're going to get a bunch of pocket constitutions and people can ask for them.
Yes. And we want to give away some more of these beautiful coffee cups. So come on now, make some comments on the YouTube, and so we can send some mugs out to you.
But let's go back to Jill. She's a nice lady.
Not Jill, Judy.
Judy.
So Judy sent us an email, and basically she said that she enjoys watching the show. Thank you, Judy. But what she wants to know is she wants to hear how hospitals are treating patients that are hospitalized in ICU. And of course, in her email, she also talks about the use of hydroxychloroquine. So I'd like to get your thoughts on that.
So I actually was watching Bud Stonebreaker's church this past weekend, and he had this lady from the mainland, Nurse Erin, and they had a conversation for his sermon. She's a nurse from Florida, went to New York City when the hot, heavy COVID stuff hit last spring. And she actually talks about that whole thing. And maybe we can get her to call in the next couple of weeks to share, because it's very scary what they were doing in New York.
Yeah, and actually we do want to do that. We want to have a show where we talk about vaccinations. That is a very big thing. And for those of you in Hawaii that want to know more specifically about vaccinations, you can go to a group called Hawaii for Informed Consent. And that's really what they focus on, is vaccinations. And so you want to go check them out, and maybe especially if you are concerned about vaccinations. So Jim, I know you had some more thoughts you wanted to share on the COVID thing, or did you do that?
Well, there's a more recent study that I decided not to bring with me from last week that looked at what's the rate of protection from getting COVID and having the antibodies because you got the virus, or taking the vaccine. And it was kind of interesting because at the same time that study was being written up and put in the thing and published as a peer review article, we're hearing that, oh no, China has a new one 10 times as much.
I know.
Right?
I know.
So maybe next week we can talk about that study, but it basically
next week we've got a special show because it's Holy Week.
Oh, that's right.
So when we come back the following week,
later. But so the study was looking at the effectiveness of the vaccine antibody that's artificially put in, or the naturally occurring antibody when you get the virus. And I'm going to loosely say that they appear to be equally effective.
Okay.
But we'll get into the real details next time.
Yeah, well, we're going to continue the discussion. The last question she asks, Jim, that I'd like to get your thoughts on. It says, why can't we, the public, have our own primary care physician prescribe these medications to prevent us from contracting this horrible virus? Well, before you get, my thought on this is that, your physician works for you. And so if your physician is not willing to have these conversations, shop around. Maybe you'll find one that will.
So I want to talk about the study that we were looking at today. There's a whole section on therapeutics and what the CDC was doing with rejecting therapeutics. Dr. Fauci, more than 10 years ago, was a very big proponent, according to the study, of hydroxychloroquine for COVID virus. Not the 19, but the one they had 10 years ago. And so you want to read that study because there's more than just what I was interested in. I was interested in it from the political, you own the government side, but there's a bunch of science in it. Like I said, hydroxychloroquine's one of the sections primarily, and there's almost 200,000 deaths from COVID when comorbidities are taken into consideration, but they're calling it COVID back in October of last year. There's too much politics in COVID, and we got to get out of that. We can't let it go on.
All right. And we will continue the discussion on vaccination. So thank you again, Judy, for sending the email. Give you a shout out. In fact, Judy, I'm going to contact you. Maybe we'll send you a mug. All right. Jim. So I want to jump into this parentage bill that you've talked about. But before we jump into the parentage bill, I want to give a little bit of context here. Way back when, way a long time ago.
Before same-sex
marriage, you were on the Commission on Sexual Orientation and the Law, and that was here in Hawaii. And you guys were given a task. And from that moment until now, you have very strong opinions about task force that are built to go one way or another. So why don't you share your thoughts on that?
So in 1995, were you born yet? Anyway,
no.
In 1995.
No, I'm only 5.
In 1995, that was 25 years ago. the legislature created by
That was when I met you. I met you when you were on that commission.
Created this governor's commission on sexual orientation and the law. The governor appointed people. The Senate president appointed a person. The Speaker of the House appointed somebody. I think the Bar Association appointed somebody. Anyway, there were 7 members that were picked by individually. And Joe Suki, who was the Speaker of the House, asked me to do it, and I said, okay. So this was after the first attempt to create the commission based on representation in religious and social organizations was struck down by the court because the Constitution says no religious test can be used for holding public office. And if you're getting picked because you're a Mormon and a Catholic and a Presbyterian, that's a religious test.
My boss at the time had been appointed to the committee, and then he was booted off.
So I got to actually be on the task force that really did have a task force. And there were 7 of us. And from the very first minute, it became quite obvious that 5 of the 7, and what we were tasked with doing is examining basically why or why not to allow, at that time, domestic partnership, but it was same-sex couple marital rights. It wasn't marriage. They hadn't gotten there yet. This was in 95. And at our very first meeting, I mean, it was kind of funny. All the newspapers were there, all the TV news, there were cameras everywhere. And so we had our opening meeting, and it became very clear that 5 out of the 7 thought we should just have same-sex marriage. Oh. That wasn't even the question.
Okay, so, and we're going to, in future shows, we'll go more into detail about this because you were very creative in how you dealt with those hearings. And we want to put a teaser out there. We want to come back and talk about this. But so fast forward to your issues, and you've talked about it here on the show, your issues with this parentage bill that actually it recently passed the Senate committee with some amendments. And this really upset you because the bill changed to a task force. And actually, there was a article that was recently in the Honolulu Star-Advertiser of an op-ed that you sent in.
Sometimes they actually publish op-eds that I write, which is kind of cool.
Yes.
So, okay, I'm going to have to, I don't remember the name of this organization because it doesn't.
Affirm.
It's a representative of Affirm, but it's capital A, capital F, the number 3, capital I, capital R, capital M, Hawaii. So a representative of this organization is one of the task force members. And I have been politically active here for decades. I never heard of him. So I looked it up online, Googled it. And I looked them up in the Department of Commerce and Consumer Affairs. They're not even a Hawaii organization.
Okay, so unfortunately, we're running out of time. But let's if you go to HawaiiFamilyAdvocates.com, this op-ed is posted, so you can go read it. And Jim will have him do a little bit more talking about this. But what I want to do is I want to give a shout out to Sharon N. and Vivian W., who also emailed us and gave us some suggestions on the show. Not just suggestions on the show, but again, they were really grateful for the show. And so we give them, so we give them a shout out. And of course, a good friend of mine, Derek P., you know who you are, really appreciate you and your support watching this show.
Well, then I want to say that Cal and Gary and Derek tell me that they watch it every week.
All right. Well, you know who you are watching this show. Again, send me an email at eva@kalotv.com. We are looking for people to partner to make this show happen. So make sure you reach out to kalotv.com and find out how you can partner to make this show happen. As always, we're grateful to K-Light Radio for the use of this beautiful studio. And we are not done having these discussions. So you want to stay plugged into us. Next week, a very special show with Kahu Wendell Davis as we move into Holy Week. And then Jim will be back the following week. So we're going to get really excited about not only next week's special show with Kahu Wendell Davis, because he always shares his heart. And we're going to be talking about Easter. And then the week after that, we'll have Jim Hockberg back as usual to kind of let us know what's happening in that mind of his. Jim?
Well, I just love doing this, so please, join in. Let's go.
Yeah, we have to give Jim something to do because I think his life without this, what is the excitement in your life without this show, Jim?
Oh, man, every minute of every day, I just enjoy myself.
All right, and you all make our day. So thanks for spending time with us today, and we will see you next time. Mahalo, everybody.
Aloha.